They're in. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming along. All right. So my name's Savan Walker, and I am the TASA postgraduate committee member. I'm the co-chair of the postgraduate committee with TASA, actually. And this is my month to present a TASA PG Thursday. The title is Sociology Beyond the Thesis, Creative Outputs and Collaborative Writing. And the theme was chosen based off of some of the PG students' surveys that we took earlier this year who wanted to understand how sociology could be accessible, how they might be able to take their theory into the real world, and how to engage with the classical and theoretical sociological concepts in contemporary dialogues. So this is what the presentation's about, and I've got Mary Zournazi with me here, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But first of all, I wanted to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also am enrolled at UNSW in the Randwick campus, so I do quite a bit of work from the lands of the Bedegal peoples. And I wanted to acknowledge their past and present histories, communities, and peoples, but also point out that one of the underlying kind of messages of this talk is that it's not just about acknowledging diverse perspectives, which is important, but it's also kind of about how the ways of collaboration work for future, more just futures and collaborative and inclusive updates to sociological concepts. So I'll introduce myself and then talk about the conversation, and I'm going to introduce Mary in a moment. But we'll just say hi, Mary. Thank you for coming in, so you're not waiting there for the whole time. And thank you for coming today, everyone. So, yeah, like I said, my name's Savan, and I'm a PhD student at the University of New South Wales in the School of Arts and Media. And actually, sorry, I'm just going to change my view so I can see the chat rather than the participants. So I'm a little bit more prepared. Okay, here we go. Hello, Anne, and hello, Jay. Thank you. Um, so I'm at the School of Arts and Media, and my general research topic is in feminist aesthetics, spirituality, ethics, and meaning making. And I'm the host for you today. And I'm going to introduce Mary in a moment, and I'll be doing an in-conversation style talk with Mary about her practice and her experience in collaborative work and writing. So if you have questions, I was thinking that because it is kind of like a casual lunch presentation, if you do have questions and they're relevant to what we're talking about at the time, please kind of put them in the chat and I'll do my best to integrate that into our conversation. If they get left or you think of something later, I'm going to leave 10 to 15 minutes free for a Q&A at the end. All right, so let's get started. Okay. I'm just looking at the chat. Okay, so I've got with me Associate Professor Mary Zournazi. Mary is a filmmaker, an author, and a scholar, and is currently working at the University of Newcastle in the School of Humanities, Creative Industries, and Social Sciences. Mary's award-winning documentaries include the 2016 Dogs of Democracy, which is a film set in Greece following the phenomena of dogs in protests to understand human compassion and symbols of hope during economic crises, and the 2021 My Rembetika Blues, which explores the concepts of immigration, home, and intergenerational emotion and cultures through the beautiful music of Rembetika. I will also pop links to those documentaries in the Zoom chat shortly, so you can kind of see the results of this talk in your own time. In academia, Mary's experience in collaborative writing projects is useful for extending the ways of seeing conceptual sociological problems. So Mary's co-authored Justice and Love, a philosophical dialogue with Rowan Williams, who's the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And she's also worked with well-known German filmmaker Wim Wenders for the book titled Inventing Peace, a Dialogue on Perception. In both of those books, Mary's scholarship has through her scholarship and her background in philosophy and classical sociology, she's been able to extend theoretical concepts by integrating various perspectives and stories through back and forth discussions. So these are big concepts like love, peace, and hope. And right now, Mary's working on a new documentary titled Acropolis Cats and Other Wondrous Animals, and another book titled The Future of Hope, as a reflection on post-COVID democracy and war. So, also in addition, she works with Christos Salakis, who's an Australian fiction author on things like Salomon's Dream, which was a play, and is currently working on a fiction film titled The Cousins, which is all amazing because we can access all of those amazing things afterwards and have a bit more of a context later. Okay, so Mary's kindly come to share those insights and the experience of collaborative writing, filmmaking, and academia. And I thought that this was really useful because sociology has a strong relationship to art and classical theory. And so some of these creative outputs can kind of, I hope that they ignite or inspire some of our sociology students who are PG students to think about how you can professionally develop sociology in contemporary contexts. So thank you, Mary, and we'll start to listen to you now. And I'll stop talking.
Did you want to pose an initial question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So firstly, I think I'm keen to hear about your general experience pairing sociology and creativity together, because obviously at some stage you thought that it was a necessary and it had to be undertaken in your own practice. So what kind of piqued your interest in collaborative writing, this turn in filmmaking, and what sorts of sociological concepts ground that practice?
Okay, maybe I could start with just how I got to here in a sense. So I just also for postgraduates, they might be interested in that. So I initially did actually an honours in philosophy and what at the time was women's studies when it existed. It's mostly gone now from campuses, unfortunately. But anyway, and then did a PhD, which was also philosophical and sociologically oriented. But I didn't really find, I think all the way through doing that research, I was always interested in how to translate or communicate key ideas or key concepts across scholarly worlds and also public outward facing. So I've somehow just always been interested in that collaboration. Like, how do you actually get really difficult ideas and share them so that they can then become part of a kind of a world or a life world of other people, not just tied within the academy. And I think there were a couple of moments, I mean, my own background, I think, kind of drew that in because of the way I grew up. So we were a migrant family. We grew up sort of working class. I grew up working class. And so even though they had been a different class in a different country, and I think some of those questions really, real sociological questions that I sort of grew up with, I think was that drawing card to the conceptual realm of sociological thinking. But at the same time, the real need to push different stories and different ideas into the world, because in a sense, when I was first doing my initial research, I mean, I'm talking like early 90s, even though it seems like a long time ago, it actually wasn't that long ago. But even then, there wasn't a huge amount of multicultural, multiverse, stories, or if they were very oriented towards particular kinds of bodies and particular kinds of ideas. And now we're in a situation where there's more diversity, let's say, in ideas and so on. But at the same time, we're hitting a wall against, limitations about what can be said and what can't be said. So I think it's really an interesting moment to try to fuse together important sociological concepts. Like for me, emotions have been a big one. Questions of war, questions of peace, questions of justice. So really big things, but then finding them grounded in everyday kind of discourse and life. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I fully agree with how important it is right now. I think what you're saying is, yeah, even what you've written is quite contemporary. Like just before this conversation, I had a look at, because I've already read a couple of your books, but I wanted to kind of refresh the inventing piece kind of with Wim Wenders. And I like that you wrote in that, I actually wrote down the quote, so I'll say it verbatim. You wrote, from our encounters and investigations into peace, it seems that much of the hindrance to peace resolves around the question of how we look at the world but don't really see it, and
Mm.
when there's so much violence, injustice, and in suffering. And so overcoming that in that introduction, you've suggested that you can really only get there through the unification of a multitudes of sense making, memory, technology, and viewership, kind of in these like media driven worlds. It's almost like you're saying it's really is diverse, but it's also not at the same time, and that's an interesting tension. Um, and I
Yeah.
think that it's actually really interesting now because I remember watching the news a couple of days ago, and Netanyahu was on there saying peace is only possible through strength, and that's kind of this idea still that peace is an apparatus that we apply onto situations rather than a collaborative discussion and an extension of theory.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so I think that what you're saying, yeah, it really is contemporary.
Mm.
Um, and so when you've conducted your collaborative writing and in your processes that you've gone through, you kind of
Mm.
have access to the conceptual study, right? Like you've done the philosophy
Mm.
degree and you know what you're talking about theoretically. But I'm
Not
kind of
always.
interested.
Just
Do we always know?
put a hypothesis in a bit of bracket. Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
But so
Mm.
I'm kind of interested to kind of understand
Mm.
what it's like working with filmmakers and community members who actually don't have a sociological background and what
Yeah.
you've done to kind of, yeah, overcome this kind of, we do sometimes feel restraint, I think, in theoretical things because we've got to make sure it all makes sense and justify it. But they don't have that so much with community members or filmmakers. It's a totally different articulation of concepts. So how do you bring them together?
Yeah. Look, I think there's a couple of things. One is, and look, this may sound, it was not meant to sound. In a way, I always start the collaboration in the sense that you're starting from a point where it is a collaboration. So what you're coming to with your series of concepts or ideas or ways of thinking have to be ready to be shifted, and also have to be able to be communicated. So if you're living in a world where you can't express to a certain degree what you're trying to communicate, then that becomes a block, initially. And I think it's about trying to find a way to speak a language that you can share, but at the same time acknowledging that you're going to learn something out of that process. So that learning or that practicality or that relationship will transform your own conceptual way of thinking about things. So you're not coming in with a already set of ideas. I mean, you may have certain trainings, but it doesn't mean that your training perhaps is not open to hearing what is being said or different. And then look, with film, it's an interesting one because practitioners often don't always think conceptually. And I think one of the interesting things as, bringing sociological facts, let's say, or sociological questions to these things is to really help understand what it means to actually be involved in those practices, and so that what you're communicating or what you're working with, the medium you're working with, becomes a really vital tool to transmit knowledge. So it's not about either side really having a sense of their own set of agendas, but really coming together to kind of create something different and something new. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that circumvents this kind of idea that you using participants in a research study just as examples. They've got to kind of be collaborators in that
Yeah.
conceptual sense.
Well, it's also, I think, one of the things that sociology and certainly feminist work has done over many decades is to really
Mm.
break open the idea of that kind of notion of objectivity, that you are coming to, a research with a series of your own biases and prejudices and questions, and having to be reflexive or critical around those stances. So when you are collaborating, I mean, there are a whole range of ethical questions associated with that as well. And clearly, when you're working creatively, there are ethical questions when you're dealing with, interviewees or whatever you want or however you want to frame that research. So, yeah, I think that, what sociological thinking does actually is prepare you to to come back to your initial part of that question, is actually prepare you to think through the dilemmas and the problems a bit more accurately than if you didn't have that training. So those kind of conceptual classical concepts of, class and race and things like that, have been shattered and opened out because they're problematic in and of themselves. But that the fact that they exist helps to maneuver and navigate, I reckon, creative and different methodological approaches to sociology, philosophy, anthropology. Yeah.
Yeah. And so with the relationships that you've had in filmmaking, I suppose I'm interested to see, I'm not expecting, I suppose, everyone to pick up a camera and start filmmaking, but I am interested in how that kind of creative output or this kind of different version of rather than publishing an article, has it allowed you to break out of any kind of academic, scholarly, or institutional barriers that you've had professionally?
Oh, absolutely, yes, because it forces you to engage with the material that you're researching in a really different way. And so writing an article or writing a book or making a film, it all involves research, different forms of research. But I think when you're working in film, there are other also questions that need to be asked as you're generating that research, and that is, who are you? Who's the object of your gaze, so to speak, and what does that mean, and how are those questions then sort of resolved in your creative process? So I think the question that I think is interesting for postgraduates and people working in sociological fields too is how do you think about the research that you're doing, and how could it also be communicated in a way that does break open perhaps traditional ideas of what is academic or what is scholarly. And I think challenging those things is really even more important now too, because we have so much, there's so much information. We do live in that kind of economy of information. And I think it's really important to sort of have moments where you're intercepting that with really good theoretical, creative, conceptual work that can speak scholarly and out to a broader audience. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because I noticed when I started the PhD sometime last year that you're kind of inundated with emails and workshops and talks about kind of how to use AI to write and produce better and how to kind of use it as a reflective thinking tool.
Mm.
And I think I've dappled with it a couple times, but I think it definitely does have that underlying message that it's about this publish or perish, or this like produce something so that you can get so you can get it published. Um, and I think that tension is difficult because in a way it almost feels like the like the creative outputs or getting institutions to recognize these creative outputs on the same level as an article or a book is actually quite difficult. But even then, I think that it kind of potentially undermines the actual potential for classic sociological theory to even be extended in some ways.
Look, I think non-traditional research outputs have changed quite a lot.
Mm.
I think institution to institution can vary, but certainly there's more recognition that of these works. I think maybe not in a sociological program, say, but certainly more in a university context. So I think it's not everywhere. So let's not, I'm not assuming that every university does do that, but a lot of them, that recognition that these are research tools and methods and, get communicated, and they're, the weight, they can't be actually weighed the same because they're different. But in that difference, there is that scholarly recognition. So I think that's starting to become more overcome, but then, there's always different climates in when these things happen. But certainly, I think the question you're raising too, I think that's important, is not to feel beleaguered by the push to always publish. Of course, it's important. And I do think it's important to think about what you do want to write and what you do want to publish, bearing in mind as a postgraduate, you also have obligations to just actually doing the research in the first instance. So that's, I think that's a real priority, thinking
Mm.
about the creative elements of your own research, whether that's creative output or just creativity in the writing. But then thinking very seriously about what outputs, and if they are creative, then you also need to think about often creative works are much more collaborative because you do need a team. So filmmaking, you do need, well, I mean, I've written, filmed, and directed my own, but then I've always needed a sound editor and, an editor and so on and so forth, so that you're often working in teams. I might have gone a bit off topic there, but anyway.
No, yeah, no, it's good insight because yeah, I think it's good if we can be in schools that have like another media school or something that we can kind of access within that. And so one of the questions that came up in the survey with the PG students recently that we did was taking your research kind of to the real world or taking it to people in audiences. So just on the filmmaking, I suppose still, and I think we'll talk about collaborative writing in a minute too, but I'm interested to know, has your filmmaking have you been surprised by the amount of audiences that have been able to engage with these sociological concepts, or has
Yeah.
there been strange interpretations that you've never thought of before and you go, oh, okay. So
Well, there's
yeah, I'm
been
interested.
I think it can reach, the good thing about it just can reach many more people that you wouldn't actually expect. And that's the joy of it. But there was an instance where I'd been invited to like an educational workshop it was run by an American Association of Anthropology, actually. And it was Midwest, US. And it was interesting because the film was My Rembetika Blues, and they hadn't heard about this particular kind of music. And they were saying, how interesting it would be for, the younger people in these towns to kind of get a history of what that music is and was and how it relates, say, to American kind of um, blues and black struggle, for instance. And, those kinds of, I knew a lot about the American blues and the comparisons between the music, but I hadn't thought about it from the younger kind of mid-Texan sort of Midwest, Americans engaging in that way, and then sort of opening up ideas of immigration in that part of the world, which is actually, because the film's based in sort of the origins in Turkey and Greece and the Middle East. And so them sort of learning something about those questions of hospitality and migration and forced migration was really interesting, because I hadn't expected that kind of audience. Yeah, but it posed new questions for them.
Mm. Yeah, and that's what I will put the link to My Rembetika Blues actually in the chat shortly, in case no one's seen it. But one of the things that has stood out to me is I actually read The History of Jazz by Ted Gloria from the US. And when you read that and you kind of watch that film that you've made, you do understand that those sociological concepts are almost timeless, but so worth reintegrating into contemporary society and contemporary contexts.
Yeah,
So that is interesting, the Midwest. And yeah, I'm sure there's so many more music styles and
yeah.
narratives that we can learn from. So, so kind of covered a bit of filmmaking, and I wanted to also now go into the collaborative writing,
Mm,
knowing that it might be a bit more accessible for students in their postgrad if they haven't already started with an arts or media studies kind of degree, sorry, fine
mm,
arts or media studies.
mm,
So, I've mentioned two books that you've written, but you have written more than that.
mm,
But the most kind of recent ones that you've written were Justice and Love, a philosophical dialogue
mm,
with Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. And with this one, I'm interested because it's kind of a completely different ball game, really, I thought when I read it, because Rowan Williams, he's not an academic, but he is extremely intelligent and he has a background in theology and philosophy,
mm,
being an Archbishop of Canterbury. and his insights were very interesting. And I kind of, is there a difference in the working relationship that you had to establish with someone like Rowan? Um, and did it take the theory in a kind of a different turn than filmmaking?
Mm. Well, actually, Rowan, I should say, I mean, he did teach at Cambridge and so on and so forth. So he does have that
Oh, okay, yeah.
language, and you know, like he did a PhD on Dostoevsky, and you know, so he's got a kind of a really
Okay, yeah.
about him is he has what perhaps the point of your question, which is interesting, is his theological background, in many ways, is very different to my sociological in a sense, because I'm not, you know, I'm not religious in the same kind of way. But what drew us together and what the book was trying to establish in the writing was how do you meet kind of big, you know, philosophical concepts or ideas like justice and care and law and whatever. Well, law is not just a sociological and philosophical concept; it's a reality. But how do theological ideas help, or what's the history of theological ideas in these conceptual concepts, and what are ways together we can find a language that's going to speak to a secular kind of society? So it was trying to find the language of our difference, really, to create something that was hoping to speak to you know, to different kind of cultural contexts today. So his theological frameworks were really enlightening to me, but also that he drew from a different set of classical works, because he's, you know, trained in Latin, as also trained in this
Wow.
kind of Russian literature. So he would
Mm.
bring forward, you know, all these Russian literature examples, and so that to me it was a way of also expanding my own knowledge. Like the collaborative writing, I find is you just you learn more. Like working with people is a joy in that sense, unless you get competitive around things. But that's another thing
Mm.
that you have to you know, learn how to navigate. Like the people that you work with, I think, are important in helping to help shape those collaborations and the writing practice. So, you know, to do things that actually are meaningful, I think. I mean, I think that's really important, that are really meaningful to you, as opposed to ticking off a box that you've published that. Like, I think that is what helps you sustain, I think, longevity in the academy, because otherwise other things will make you despair. So I think that's really important. Yeah.
Mm, it is. And I think that book is an amazing example of how that interdisciplinary approach really flourishes. Not
Yeah.
so much in just, oh, I'm going to use this framework and another framework and this methodology, and you dip
Mm.
your toe into different ways of thinking. It really is
Mm.
like the fruits come out, right? Like it's a beautiful
Mm.
relationship, like you said, with literature, theology, and with your
Mm.
sociology and the philosophy. And so you
Mm.
even took that further to a video, which I remember that you did with Michael Sandel and
Oh, we had a talk. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, which was
yeah,
one.
and I
Yeah, yeah.
sorry, yeah, I will link that as well because in my opinion, and I probably maybe I'm biased, but Michael Sandel, his thoughts on that. So if you don't know, Michael Sandel is from the Harvard Business School, and he wrote the Tyranny of
Law
Merit. What's become of the what is it? Sorry,
law school, not the
law
business.
school. Sorry,
Yeah,
law
yeah,
school.
yeah, yeah.
And he wrote The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good. And it's about meritocracy. It is also a fantastic book if no one's read it. But it was a really conceptually rich talk I've seen in this new era of kind of conversation style, post-COVID university events. And I think the reason why it was good was because you kind of gathered the right people to talk about concepts rather than talk about their insights into a news fad or a contemporary issue. And
Yeah,
one of the questions that some of the students had asked in previous surveys was this like kind of feeling that classical sociology isn't particularly, or classical context or critical theory, they kind of seem to be significantly reduced, especially if sociology classes and academics are kind of being reduced in Australia as well. And
mm,
so it kind of felt like we're in this dire need of rethinking sociology and extending concepts, but the support isn't always there for sociologists to do that work. So that talk, I will link it because I thought it was amazing because it just really knuckled down onto a concept that was so, I suppose it was so useful to think about today, but also had this really long history of research. And so that I think I'm bringing that up because I wanted to also say that these videos that you've done, the books, the collaborative writing, the filmmaking, they're also fantastic ways of establishing like data for research grants and impact and that kind of stuff. So in terms of like students and how they kind of conceptualize of these outputs,
Mm.
how have you kind of gathered evidence to present further evidence for further grant applications, research outputs, and impacts in that way, while also kind of navigating I suppose, the popularity of critical thinking and critical analysis?
Yeah, okay. Um, so is the question partly around how do you use the works for applying for different kinds of funding and things like this? Was that also part of what you were asking, or?
Yeah. How do you kind of you take these
Okay, yeah,
I guess
yeah.
their data, or like what is the data? Is it viewers? Is it how many places that
Okay.
you publish a
Yeah,
video or
yeah,
film?
it's different, I think, according to what you're arguing for. So I think yeah. So I often apply for a lot of industry grants as well. So that's the other thing for people to think about. Is so, for instance, I might go more to Creative Australia or Screen New South Wales or Screen Australia as opposed to a traditional source like the ARC, right? The ARC, however, interestingly, is changing their different forms of fellowships and grants, which may make it easier for people in the post PhD realm to actually get some funding to kickstart different projects. But I suppose one of the things I find useful is to be quite actually creative in trying to get different funding bodies associated with your work. And often with something that's like Screen New South Wales, and it's obviously easier because you're having a film, the film is the research in the background and the but in terms of academic work, it also fits in that way too, in that the narrative is, this is a produced work, it's of a certain length, it's been, peer reviewed insofar as the funding, like where it got funding from. Its impact really is about its festivals, like what festivals it's got into. So the data it's a different kind of data pool. And I think the trick for any of these things is even with more scholarly traditional, I mean, they are scholarly, so, but more traditional publications, is finding the right narrative that's going to place the research in the context of whatever you're applying for. So it's really about learning those skills, I think, as well as the work that you're doing. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, so probably that's where it wasn't clear before. I was thinking, how does that kind of data help you argue for engaging with these classical theoretical kind of concepts?
Mm.
They kind of seem like opposite things, really. Like you're trying to analyze something that's purely theoretical or this concept, right? And then you've got data
Yeah, well, they're not.
coming
I
in as
don't.
well.
Yeah, I don't see them as split like that, I think.
Mm,
I don't see theory and practice as split. So,
mhm,
and I think these are classical questions as well that are raised philosophically, conceptually, sociologically. I mean, I see theory as practice and practice as theory. So, in other words, you can't produce a work of art without some kind of conceptual framework, even though artists may say they don't do that. But nevertheless, you're still working in a context of sociality wherever you are. So
mm,
so I think for me that it's not that split generation. I think what happens is that we're forced into making those splits, and that's the issue. And
mhm,
so to work against that is to think about how these works, propel or reshape the concepts that you're thinking about. So My Rembetika Blues started up around a question of hospitality and what happened when people were forced out of their homes, and how what brought communities together, in a sense, was this particular kind of music, which was hard on the ears in the 20s, early 20s of the 20th century, but an amazing history of time, how the music's just progressed and continued in communities. So it was a way of rethinking community. So, for me, then, the work is about community. It's about finding hope and joy in those moments of the greatest despair. So there's no split in that sense for me. And so that's how I would argue its research significance, as well as where to go, when I would go for further funding. Yeah, your justification for that would be those conceptual areas.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's actually really useful and a great point that you have to intertwine them. They can't be different ways of seeing. They have to, like I said at the start, they have to kind of these multiple multimodal, multimedia kind of ways of seeing it is really important for the concept itself, but
Yeah.
also in reinventing what that concept means today.
Mm.
So I'm just going to sorry, before I forget, I'm going to put these links in the chat before I move off that kind of practical part of it. And so they're your most recent ones. So I put in Dogs of Democracy. It's on Canopy. It streams on Canopy. Same with My Rembetika Blues. I put the Canopy one in. The Future of Justice that's the talk with Michael Sandel and Rowan Williams, which is a really interesting talk. And then I've got Justice and Love, the book, and then the Inventing Peace book as well in there. So I actually had a question that I think is interesting and hear from Jay. Interested to hear your thoughts about creative writing within the context of academic research, as well as collaboration or different audiences. And I know that you had an interesting PhD thesis as well, so maybe that could be an interesting way to talk about creative writing and academic research.
Sorry, so just getting the context of that question. It's uh sorry, it's about who thought that within the content as well as kind
Yeah.
of, yeah. So Jay sort of asking about its role, or are you asking about the process? I'm just curious.
Well, it could be a little bit of either, Mary. I guess
Mm,
I'm thinking about this um, as well in terms of what creative practice means as part of research,
mm,
both in terms of where it takes you, and I guess in terms of the process as well. I guess what I'm seeing in your work is that that's kind of continued and rolled into being the character of, I guess, how you've actually expressed yourself as an academic, sort of in
yeah,
those sort of walking into world stuff. But
yes,
I'm interested in sort of bringing the creative practice into the research piece as well. Thank you.
yeah. Well, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So that, I think that, yes, so it's sort of from what does creative writing practice offer the research itself, and what it opens out, right, is what I think you're getting at. And am I right? I think that's what yeah. So I would say that it is actually what it offers us is so imperative. The same way with film, and is what they offer us are insights into ways of seeing the world, which I think, Siobhan, you're right in that framing, that give us more insight into human relationships, communities, emotions, despair, all sorts of things that you can't get often in a scholarly piece of argument. So you can get more insight into the mind of a psychopath, say, or something or other, through a creative text that then borrows or lends itself to that kind of analysis of, what is sociopathy or whatever. Do you know what I mean? It opens that out. And it's interesting for me because I'm working with Christos Tsiolkas, and we've worked for many years now, but we're working on a road movie called The Cousins. And it's interesting because it is fiction, but it's also about kind of documenting life and relationships and kind of histories of migration and storytelling. And it's like the creative work itself generates, well, we came into it with a series of, say, conceptual ideas, right? But then the work itself extends those ideas even further, so that it provides a way of investigation, if that makes sense. It gives you the tools in which to investigate questions. And that's what I always find with amazing fiction or amazing music or a film for me, because I'm obviously a film lover. Film to me teaches me so much, pedagogically it teaches me so much. So as a researcher, it offers me ways of thinking about the world and contexts and relationships. I hope that gave some, I hope that answered something.
Can I just add something briefly on there? I guess you were talking about I guess that feminist challenge in terms of positioning yourself in the research. And I think one of the things I've been thinking about is whether creative practice as part of academic practice can actually do that, be part of kind of making yourself both really visible and really reflective in terms of your place in that kind of research process. I don't know whether you've used it in that way, but I guess it's something that's been a little bit on my mind.
Yeah. Well, it certainly can. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, absolutely. It can do those things for sure, because it can help break open the confined or the limitations of what the expectations are around particular kinds of research and particular kinds of positioning. So, I mean, some of the, really wonderful work that's done that, gives you insight into different communities or different ways of thinking about things, or seeing insights into different histories that movies, for instance, bring, does do that kind of work. But are you thinking also more structurally that the work itself, you name that more in the creative work, or are you thinking you're naming it more in the exegetical part of that creative work?
Well, I think one of the fun things, and I mean, Savan talked about it before, in terms of sort of some of your practice has been bringing the conceptual into that creative practice in terms of the filmmaking and the conversation there. And
Yeah.
I guess I'm actually wondering a bit, even in the context of the PhD,
Yeah.
because I'm a student, thinking about that, sort of bringing that in conversation, so it can actually kind of take you in a dialogue that takes you somewhere different,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sort of makes you more actively part of that process.
Yes.
So it takes you right out of that kind of that
Yes.
sort of
Yeah.
the objectivity, but gives you also a way to kind of work with it. So
Yeah, yeah. So even in terms of the methods that you might use, as well as that, also,
yeah,
you might gather anecdotes or stories and that kind of relationship. But also, having said that, it's often for me the actual form of like filmmaking is what inspires the thinking, because it's a different medium. So creative writing is also, working with characters. I mean, I find just so rich, because it's a different lens or different points of view, right? So characters, how many characters you might have, you can create different positionalities in that sense, that an argument in its just sole authored or even co-authored maybe doesn't provide that. So it's actually the form itself gives you the research tools. And I think that's what's also important in communicating, that in research and in research tools like these, it's not just the concepts coming bang onto the creativity, it's actually the creativity shapes the concepts. So it's always a, kind of dialogic in that sense too. So, but in a practical sense, I think it's really important for students as well to feel the strength and the power and the passion to do that, to try to sort of break open. But you also need good mentors and collaborators, and at the end of the day, good examiners who are going to understand that as well. So it's a process, and it's also about collaboration, both with your supervisors, but also with the team eventually who will examine your work before it gets out into the world, so to speak, in terms of PhD.
Yeah, so
excellent.
thank you. And yeah, I think that's great. This kind of like being able to see the creative vision is something that I've been really drawn to in terms of working relationships as well, and collaborations. I'm an artist outside of my PhD, and art is a big part of my PhD. So that visionary insight, perceiving more than what's given is really important, I think, in that creative sense and restructuring. I loved what Mary said about film actually gives you a different trellis, I think, to have to use to get to this next area of research. And that's something I've always found is really important to kind of think outside of that. I don't know, not outside, but kind of within both the creative and coming back to the research boxes there. It can be quite interesting. So I will open it up to general questions. And I did see that there's one in here. So from Anne has written, loves the patience needed for social healing and the imagination required for new ways of relating and experiencing the world. And has asked, Mary, I like that you've got a working class background. What joys and wonders do we bring as working class people to sociology?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I was thinking about it actually, I think just recently, that question of coming from that kind of background, because actually I'm going to go right back to when I started sociology. I was at Macquarie University, and I remember there was a course that I walked into, and I left within about 10 or 15 minutes, because the course was about or it seemed to be, that lecture was about how working class people went for picnics and what they did, and and this was some kind of sociological research into insights into the working class. And I'm sure it's actually really was a good lecture, but initially it just like, what the hell is this, And I think what I found in traditional kind of sociological understandings of the working class, of course, on the initial, was that it was usually very white and Anglo and whatever in the 70s and the 80s. And of course, then it opened out. But what I think that experience of coming from, a different, a different class is that it, for want of a better word, you don't necessarily take the politeness of a bourgeois society. So you're aware of the cracks and the fissures and the difficulties, both institutionally and in your life circumstances. And so it provides a pivot for really getting into more, maybe sometimes dangerous territory, but more gritty territory, to sort of really, and I think a commitment, an ethical commitment, to try to share more stories and more experiences that often aren't, part of a, let's not say mainstream, but part of a more popular sense of what makes us who we are. And so I think, in many ways, I'm very grateful for that, although, as migrants at a particular time in Australian history, it wasn't an easy experience. And so that those questions of patience as well have become really important also in all research. I think that you really need to be patient with the work, and you also need to be patient with the questions you're asking, because sometimes, whether they're creative, they're always creative, actually, the questions, but the questions themselves can lend, they may not be clear at the start when you're doing something, and they become clearer over time.
Absolutely. And I just before, because is there any other questions from the group, or Anne, did you want to respond with anything? Oh, yep, not just now. Yes, well, I'll just echo that, and I agree with Mary that it's that actual experience of being in the world, then coming to sociology, and it's about, I think I've interestingly seen how it's theorized and how it's felt are totally different things, and that's kind of why I think the working class has even if you want to call it that now, it's she says, I have a working class underfunded laptop and it's protesting.
Yeah, well, yes, it's having to making fill the gaps, isn't it, as well? Yeah.
Yes, okay. Well, if there's no other questions, I didn't have any other questions myself in terms of the content. I think we've relatively gone through them. So if anyone has any other questions, I'll open it up now. And if not, Mary, if you've got anything else you'd want to add,
Yeah.
then yeah, Here's your chance.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about the sort of PhD student in that sense too, like what it, it's a space in a way to test out ideas. And in terms of, the creative outputs that may not be, natural, for want of a better word, to your working process. I think it's interesting to sometimes take a challenge and do, even a podcast or something where it forces you to think a little bit differently about how you might structure an argument. And sometimes those exercises really do, or helps one get the work out into a broader context, but it also teaches you another range of skills that can become useful in presentations and also meeting other people too. So if somebody not that, millions and millions of people don't always come across or hear or see your work, but sometimes you can share that with somebody and say, look, I've done this, what would you be interested in developing a collaboration around something or something. So I think just being a bit bold and also being aware of time, and time can, there's constraints one has, but sometimes just taking that leap can be useful. But also coming back to, I think, Jay's question too, I think that creativity, yeah, it's you actually learn from the tool or the medium itself. So when you're doing something, say theatrical or fictional or film or whatever, it's the form itself that teaches you also ways to think.
Yeah, thank you for those insights. And I don't have any more questions, so I guess we'll call it that's for the TASA Thursday, the PG event. Thank you so much, Mary. It was really great hearing from you, and we're so lucky, and I'm sure that many people will hear from you on the recording as well. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, Sivan. Thank
Thanks,
you,
Mary.
everyone. And thank you, TASA, for organising this. So it was great. Thank you.